Various organizations marching against austerity measures and budget cuts. Trade Union Federation COSATU says that the public service is buckling under continued austerity measures. It's called on Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana to deliver a pro-poor budget. The federation is among a host of civil society organizations which marched to Parliament ahead of the budget speech. All right, for more on this, let's now speak to Professor Isaac Khambule, Professor of Political Economy and Director of the Africa Center for Evidence at the University of Johannesburg. Prof, a very good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for your time. I mean, when he started his budget speech, the minister, in fact, said that for the first time in 17 years, debt will stabilize and it will continue to fall in the coming years. I mean, the budget deficit has narrowed, as he said, and debt service costs are also falling. But in 2026, the government will still have to spend 432.4 billion rand on debt repayments as well as interest. What were your key takeaways from his budget? But I particularly want you to also just synthesize this debt question too in terms of the budget.
No, thank you so much, Unati, and good day to all the SABC viewers. This is definitely one of the core, issues that were also touched on during the G20 when it was hosted here in South Africa, because we know the issue of debt is quite high throughout the African context and as well as within many developing nations. And we know the more we spend on servicing our debt, it means that we will have less. There is necessarily going to the services and as well as promoting the growth of this country. And as things stand, it is quite good that debt is stabilizing, but I think the key takeaway that we should also look at is, in as much as debt is stabilizing, we are also spending more on other avenues, and particularly in this case, if you look at other means such as your social wage, of which again is quite high, up to 60% of the budget, and we know we have been failing in terms of transitioning people from social grants to the labor market, of which again, had we been successful in doing that, it would mean that our debt would have stabilized and been lower than what it currently is.
Yeah, I want to touch, I'm going to come back to that debt question, because if we look at, for instance, that government is spending more on servicing debt than on basic education and health, it does still raise concerns. But let's touch quickly on social grants. I mean, social grants increase modestly, and the SRD continues, but within fiscal limits. I mean, is this enough to cushion inequality, especially amid this 1.6% growth economy in 2026, 2% forecasted by 2028, do you think?
Well, it's definitely not enough. We must remember that a food basket in this country will cost you roughly around 4,000 rand to 5,000 rand a month. So wherever we keep on giving as social grants and as well as other type of grants is not necessarily sufficient to ensure that people can be moved out of poverty. And that is why, again, as a country, we have a high poverty rate estimated to be around 55.5% of the population. So if we look at this again in hindsight and based on international standards, we do know that wherever people are getting for social grants is not going to be enough to ensure that they can buy all the essentials that they need. And we know again that issues such as the cost of electricity, the tariff increases over the years, have then put people in a situation whereby they need to spend more on electricity, meaning that they have now less money to save and as well as to spend on food. And the core issue of energy poverty. And now we're also getting into other issues such as water again. And we ask ourselves as to how do we then as a country maintain and also grow our economy if we are facing all of these infrastructure deficits, and while again also understanding that we have a high rate of those who are on social grants.
And let's talk about, what most, political parties, particularly those within the GNU, had really welcomed, saying that this was, in fact, a budget of hope for the nation. Good news in as far as households are concerned, that proposed 20 billion rand income tax increase that was scrapped, due to stronger revenue. So for the first time, essentially, in a while, income tax brackets and rebates will now be increased in line with inflation, which means people will not have to pay more tax if their salaries and wages increase by inflation. Just your comment around this and how important it was for the minister to make this particular announcement.
Well, this is a significant announcement, Unati, because if you recall, last year, if you look at the tax rebate, most people were affected because in as much as they were able to get particular increases, those particular increases were not reflected in their pay slips at the end of the month because of the rebate issue and taxing. So for this year, we know then that as soon as people get those particular increases, they are likely again to be affected and then show that they will have better impact on their livelihoods. And I think the other key thing that was quite important as well was that if you look at the VAT issue, we know now it's businesses that are going to be on the upwards of more than 2 million rands annually who are going to be required to pay VAT. And that on its own, again, is going to encourage a lot of businesses to continue to grow and as well as employ because they know that they are tax exempt. But from where we stand, I think you've raised a core issue of taxes, and most South Africans are going to be happy knowing that they have more to take home this year.
I want to just circle back, to our conversation about how government is, spending and how it's servicing its debt. I mean, questions arising now that, at what point does debt servicing begin to undermine long-term human capital formation? Because as it stands now, you have for the year 2026, 2027, government spending 16 rands, 20 cents, for every 100 rands it spends. So in other words, compared to the 13 rands, 43 cents towards basic education. So again, concerns around how much we spend on vital, resources like education and health, as an example. Prof, can you hear us? All right, we seem to have lost Professor Khambule there, of course, just reacting to the recent budget announcement. Prof, can you still hear us? Are you with us? Can you hear me?
Can you hear me, Unatim?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear. Did you hear my question?
Yes, I did. And I think that's one of the core things that we have faced because we know the more we spend on debt servicing, again, we tend to take away from the budget, focusing on education budget, especially in basic education, because we know year in and year out, there are particular cuts of which affects even the poorest of communities, especially those who are able to get free transport in their communities. And from what we have seen over the years, the more we spend in terms of servicing our debt, the less we tend to spend on education, of which again means that we need to do more to ensure that as a country, we can service our debt in a manner that is going to be sustainable and also ensure that we reduce our borrowing and spending patterns in unnecessary stuff.
Yeah, and I want to talk about, the growth, strategy for government, because again, whilst, this particular budget was somewhat welcomed by many political parties, there are those that say it's not really a good news when you look at the unemployment crisis in this country. So looking at which levers to then make sure that you attach yourself to in terms of growth strategy. I mean, for one, infrastructure-led growth, is it more realistic without deep reforms, at municipal governance and SOE level? So at what point, are those important? All right, we seem to have trouble with Professor Khambule's, audio there, as well as his sound and screen. But we'll see if we can come back to him as we continue, of course, to look at the budget that was just tabled by the Minister of Finance. Of course, Professor Isaac Khambule is a Professor of Political Economy and Director of the Africa Center for Evidence at the University of Johannesburg.